Hey, what's up guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be breaking some hearts with After Effects and Element 3D. So if that sounds interesting, let's get started. Before we hop into After Effects, we are going to need some models. So I went on TurboSquid and found a free model of a heart. Now I took this heart into Maya and used a plugin called Pull Down It to do the shattering. If you are using Maya, then you know that the default Maya shatter is garbage. So I highly recommend Pull Down It. They have a free demo which allows you to shatter up to 64 pieces, which is adequate for what we need. I also grabbed a free bullet model. Now in my version, the bullet is going so quickly that you don't even need to know it's a bullet. It could just be a cylinder, but if you want it to slow down, you need something bullet-like, and you may as well just use this free model. Now you probably want to grab the same geometry that I am using, so in the link in the description you can grab the shattered heart pieces that I have. So I have 3 different pieces for the heart. I have an upper, lower, and center piece. I also have some 3D text which is shattered. We're not actually going to use that for the tutorial, but you guys might want to play around with this. I also have the bullet model converted to an OBJ. We have a crystal normal map and a grunge texture. You guys, of course, can use whatever you like. The concepts are going to be the same, but if you'd like to follow along and use the same assets that I use, these are provided in the link in the description. All right, let's get started in After Effects. So we're going to need a new composition. I'm using UHD 4K, 30 FPS, and 150 frames. For the project settings, I'm using 32 bits per channel, and I'm not linearizing, so recall that you generally don't linearize with Element. We're not using any types of raw or linear files, and to the best of my knowledge, there is no color management for Element 3D in the first place, so if you do linearize, you can end up overcorrecting your input. Alright, so let's get started with a background. So for the background, we're going to grab a gradient ramp effect. We're going to change the type to radial, drag this middle target down here, pull this out down to the side here, and then for the start color, you can do something like a light pink, and for the end color, you can do a dark pink. If you'd like to add just a little bit more vignetting around the sides, we can do that with the CC vignette effect and just lower the amount a little. We could also grab a curves and just play around with the brightness. Just gonna make that a little bit darker. All right, so that's what I did. Next, we need a new solid for Element 3D. We'll just call this Element and grab the Element effect. All right, so open up Scene Setup. I'm gonna maximize this, and next we can go into Import. So these are the models that are available in the link in the description. We're gonna need these 3 first. So click Open. Now this is important. We do need to force the alignment to from model. So force alignment from model for all 3 of these pieces. If you do model center, then you'll have to realign the pieces, and you probably won't do it exactly. Pull Down It provides a very, very clean mesh once it's shattered. So this is what we need. We want to have that really, really clean. Otherwise, you'd have to have another heart geometry which is not shattered, and then you'd have to switch back and forth at the moment that it would shatter, which is a little bit more of a hassle. So next, let's create a really quick surface for this. And I'm just going to do this manually. So if we open up any one of these, and you'll notice that there are several different materials in here. These are generated in Maya. So like I said, if you do want a tutorial on how you create new shading groups, we can go over that. But for now, the ones that say PDI, this is the pieces that are inside the heart. And we're just going to focus on the outside for now. So we're just going to use this one. And we're going to go down to the diffuse color. We're just going to set that to black. I'm going to reduce the glossiness as well to something like 65%. For the reflectivity, we're going to make that red. We'll do about 40% reflectivity. On the refraction, we'll make this also red. We'll do like a darker red for the refraction. Crank that up to 100%. For the illumination, we'll also do red. And for the intensity, we'll do 100%. Then you can play around with the Fresnel. So if you increase the Fresnel, you will get a little bit of a darker result. Let's scroll up to the top. And then for the normal bump, we're going to add a custom texture here. So let's load a texture, and we'll take this grunge map here. So we're going to convert this to a bump map, and then let's just use about 10%, and then click OK. So to see this a little bit better, we're going to apply the same material to the other outer layer of the lower heart and the upper heart. So just right click over this one, copy material, and then paste material and paste material. So all 3 of these are actually the same. They're just instanced, but we can just see the geometry a little bit better now. So if we go back up to the heart center, go to UV mapping and change the texture mapping to box. Then on the UV repeat, I'm just going to stretch that out a little bit, and we'll do something like 0.3. And then do the same thing for the heart lower. Once again, change this to box, 0.3, box, and then 0.3 for the Y parameter. All right, so that's just gives us a little bit more extra texture. And actually on the illumination here, I'm just gonna lower that a little bit. I think 100% is just too much. We'll do something like 25. All right, so that looks pretty good. Next, we're going to do one for the inner pieces here. So it doesn't matter which one of these you click on, they're all going to be the same in a moment. All right, so let's zoom in here and then disable the outer layer, and then we can see inside. And this is all the different shards inside. So click on any one of these PDI materials. Then for the normal bump, go to load texture, do this crystal normal. And then for the UV repeat, do 4 and 4. This also might be more clear if we turn off the lower and upper heart pieces. You can see that texture a little bit better. And we'll scroll down to reflectivity, change that to red. Then we'll just add a little amount of redness to that, like 5%. You can add some refraction as well, crank that up to 100%. And then you can play around with the distortion amount as well. For the illumination, we're going to make this bright red. And then do an intensity of 25% again, something like that. For the Fresnel, we can increase that again, back up to 0.95. And there's also the bias as well. So if you play around with the bias, you will also get different results. I quite like that. All right, so I think that looks pretty good for what we need. Turn these layers back on. And next we need to separate these so they're in the correct groups. So we're gonna have 3 different groups. So we'll click this little group folder down here. We'll get another group. We can pull this group right to the very bottom until it goes to a red line. That means it's underneath the existing group. Then we can do that again for a third group. For the first group, we can leave the upper part in there. So we'll take out the center, put that in group 2. Click and drag that over the group folder. Then for the heart lower, drag that to the bottom here. All 3 groups need to have a unique ID. So 1 is going to be the first one, and then 2, and then 3. So the very last thing is we need to copy that material we just made for the inner piece and apply that to all the other PDI materials. So right click, copy, and we're just going to paste this one by one over all of these other pieces. So that's just instancing that same material over all of the different shading groups. So click OK. All right, so next we can set up a camera. So right click, new camera. The default values are fine. Now I'm going to go into the element render settings, go into render settings, lighting, additional lighting. And for the add lighting, I'm going to say product. And to speed things up while we work through this, change the render mode to preview. So this will make everything just a little bit grainy, but it will kind of speed up your workflow. Back on this product, I am going to increase the brightness as well, more like 600%. There's also some faceting here, so we can fix that inside the scene setup. So on the heart upper, go down to surface options, and then for the normals, change this to auto normals, and 35 is fine. You'll notice how that smooths it out. So if we go to the next one here, so auto normals, then auto normals, click OK. And then you'll see the faceting goes away. All right, so for this next part, we're gonna need to rough out the animation of the heart exploding. And there are loads of different ways that you can do this. I'm gonna show you the settings that I use for it. And I'm gonna speed things up a little bit because there are a lot of keyframes that you can tweak, and you can continue tweaking them depending on what speed you want these to go and how much you want them to displace or scatter or whatever. So I'm gonna show you the settings that I used. I'm gonna speed parts of this up just so I don't bore you all to death. We're gonna actually start by just pulling the camera out just a little bit and then lowering this. So for the new controls for After Effects, I'm going to use the orbit tool. So it's very similar to the original tool, but to pan and dolly, you want to hold down the Alt key, and then you can have access to the same controls without having to switch to these other tools up here. So just hold down Alt, and then you can pan with the middle mouse button clicked and dolly with right mouse button in and out. So to start blocking out the animation, we're going to click on the element layer, and then we're going to need to open up those first 3 groups. So we're going to open up Particle Look and Particle Replicator for groups 1, 2, and 3. And for each of these, in Particle Look, we're going to open up Multi-Object and enable Multi-Object. This is going to open up an entire submenu, and this is going to be important when we want to affect the behavior of the individual pieces of geometry. Okay, so I'm just going to go through and then start keyframing the channels that I need. So on group 1 for position XY, we're going to keyframe that at frame 30. So open up rotation, and we're going to keyframe the Z rotation. And then in multi-object, we're going to animate the rotation random. And then we're also going to animate displace. So on group 2, we're going to animate position XY, open up rotation. We're also going to do the Z rotation. In multi-object, we're going to animate the size, the rotation random multi, the displace, and then we can also do the scatter multi, and then the noise amount multiplier. Lastly, in 3, we're going to animate the position XY. In rotation, we're animating Z rotation, rotation random multi in multi-object, displace, and then we could also do the scatter multi here as well. Right, so to see which channels we've keyframed, click U. We've keyframed quite a lot of these. For this, I'm just going to go forward 5 frames and then start tweaking these values. So let's actually start with the Z rotation, and then for the Z rotation, we could just do something pretty subtle, like 10 degrees or so, and then just move this over. So between 30 and 40 is where the majority of the initial shattering is going to occur. So between these frames, I'm just going to offset some of the channels so they're not always exactly on the same frame. So here we could do something like 25 degrees, just so there's a little bit of variation of the pieces. And then for the displacement, we can actually have the displacement start just a little bit offset here at frame 35. And then for the rest of these, we're going to go all the way to the very end, so frame 149, and then we can start just expanding this out even more. For the position XY, so we can raise the height up, so just lower this parameter here. For the rotation random multi, increase that, something like 100 degrees, so we pull that out here. And then for the displacement, we can increase that so it's like 0.5, so those pieces kind of fly out like this. So it's going to initially shatter, and then they're just going to slow down as they fly out. And we'll worry about doing the easing in a little bit later. All right, so next for the second group. For this one, it's actually going to be easier to start off with the displacement. So at frame 40, you can increase the displacement quite a lot. And then for the scatter multi, you can increase that to around 10 or so. And for the noise amount, and actually I meant to, instead of noise scale, I meant to do mount here. So start that at 0, then go forward to frame 40 and just increase that very, very slightly. So click U again twice to refresh the animated channels. And then we're just going to increase that to something like 0.08 or so. Increase that a little bit. We're also going to lower the size of the particle because they're very, very large. So we're just going to make them get smaller so they're not going to turn into a blurry mess when we add some depth of field. And then go all the way to the very end. Crank this really far over to the left. Gonna add some Z rotation as well. And then on the rotation random multi, you could set that to something like 4. And then on the displace, we can increase that as well, like 6. And that actually is expanding a little bit too much. So another channel that I could animate would be particle size. So if we go back to frame 30, also animate the particle size, click U again twice to open up that channel. We can have that start at 10. By frame 40, this could reduce very, very slightly. Then by the end, we could reduce that to 8. Otherwise, this is going to go too far off the screen. I'm also going to go to frame 40 and just increase the random multi, just so this is a little bit more rotation initially. Then we get something kind of like that, you know, kind of fly off. And then we've got to do the same thing for the last piece. So on position XY, just move this over a little bit to the left and then do a negative rotation amount. Increase the rotation random by a few degrees. We're gonna add a little bit of scatter multi as well, just to shift the individual pieces over a little bit. Then on the displacement amount, start that off at 0 at 35, and we'll come all the way to the very end. Increase the displacement to about 0.5, and then just move this back over just to keep it more or less in the same position. You could also increase the shatter multi and the Z rotation as well. All right, so we have a lot of keyframes animated here, but we'll get something kind of like this. So it's just going to kind of break out and then gradually the pieces kind of fly off. Now, as we go, we might tweak these settings. Like, I think perhaps this piece is going a little bit too high. We might just drop that back down and push that over just a little bit. Something kind of like that. Next, we should also add a bullet. So let's go back into our scene setup and then import that bullet geometry. So go to import, find the bullet OBJ, go OK. And then for this, we're going to scale this up so it's quite a bit bigger. And then we're going to make a new group for it. So we're going to make a new group folder, change this to group 4, and then grab that bullet, drag it into group 4. So on presets, if we go to physical, there is a gold material, so we can just double click that and you can see there's 2 shading groups and we'll just apply that there. We can tweak a couple things. So on the color, we can make this slightly more reddish by pulling this down a little bit, then clicking OK. And then of course we might come back and change some stuff, but I think for now this will be fine. All right, so for the bullet, we're actually going to start at the first frame, so frame 0. Scroll down to group 4. So open up the particle replicator and then keyframe the position XY and position Z. So for right now, let's just pull this forward just a tad just so we can see where it is. So for the rotation Y, I'm going to rotate this around about 15 degrees or so. Then we can push back position Z, just something like 2500. So remember, positive values actually go further away from the camera. Negative values come closer. To see the keyframes, I'm going to click U again twice. So on the position XY, we'll pull this over quite a lot so we can see it off to the right hand side here. Then at frame 30, we'll set the Z position to -100, and then we'll move the X and Y back so it's about in the center like that. Then we'll go forward to about frame 90, I think would be a pretty good value, and then just move this off screen. Now for the Z rotation, we could alter those values as well. So at the very beginning, it's rotated just a little bit more towards the heart. Not really necessary that we do that because it's going to be moving so quickly and blurred, but we can go ahead and do that if we want to. So on frame 30, it's good at 15, and then let's go to the very beginning and then just rotate that around a little bit more. So it's maybe 25-ish. Something like that will be good. So this is probably the hardest thing to get right with the timing. So if you want to change the speed, or you're using a different object and you just can't get it right, just play around with the displacement and the position XY to begin with. Use linear keyframes. They're going to be easier to control before you start going into the graph editor. All right, so here's what we got so far. And it's really abrupt here at frame 40. So we're going to go into the graph editor and start smoothing out some of these keyframes. All right, so right here at around frame 40, what we're going to do is select all of these keyframes, go into the graph editor, and then we're just going to click this Auto Bezier button right here. So what this is going to do is it's just going to smooth out the interpolation between all three keyframes. So if we go into something like the random rotation, for example, if we have that linear, it's very, very hard. But if we click the Auto Bezier, it's going to smooth that out. At the end here, you could choose to do an easy ease of everything, but I want to keep mine just kind of moving forward as if it's just in really slow motion. So I don't really want them to come to a stop. So I'm not going to change the animations here to ease, but we'll come back later and see if we need to alter anything. Then we can do the same thing with these keyframes in the middle here at 35. Make sure all of these are selected and then click the Auto Bezier key. And then it's just going to kind of smooth those out a little bit. This is a very abrupt explosion, and there's going to be other stuff that we start adding on top of this. So I don't want to spend too much time finessing this until we add the other components. So probably one of the coolest things that I kind of stumbled upon is how to make some kind of weird inky looking background, as if like maybe there was something in the heart that's kind of escaping out the back as the bullet gets pushed forward. So I wanted some kind of ink. Fluids in After Effects are almost impossible to do without dedicated third-party plugins. And while Element 3D is indeed a third-party plugin, it doesn't have any fluid or particle support, like a particle system. So one thing that I came up with is to work with a heavily subdivided sphere and add some displacement. So for that, we're going to grab a new solid. We're going to call this layer ink, and then we're going to add another element effect. So go back into the scene setup. And then for this, we're going to grab a sphere. And then this is probably the most important part, the segments down here. So instead of 6, we'll do 60. So if we switch to a wireframe point here, you can see it has far more geometry than with 6 pieces. So with a higher subdivision, this is going to allow us to displace the surface. So for the material, we can go into presets, physical, and then just choose something like the plastic matte. We just need something very simple. We do want it to be dark or like an inky surface. And because this is going to be displaced, we also need to go down into the surface options, and then under normals, change this to dynamic deform. And then the normal threshold is where it becomes sharp or not. So if you get some really weird sharpness, and crank this up higher. So you can go all the way up to 180 if you wanted, which means that 2 planes of geometry would have to be at 180 degrees to each other for there's a sharp edge. For now, we can just leave that at 35. All right, so that looks good. So we can click OK. So let's open up group 1, go into the particle look. We're going to go a little bit in front of frame 30, just so this has some time to grow. And then we're going to animate the particle size, then open up deform, open up twist, enable twist, and then open up noise and enable noise. So in noise, we can animate the intensity and we can animate the scale. Click U to see the keyframes. And then if we go forward to something like frame 37 or so, and I'm also going to solo this ink and then solo the background just so the heart isn't getting in the way. So as we increase the intensity, you can see that we get these weird blobs that start like extruding out from the sphere. So if we increase the scale to something around 600, we get a lot more spikes and we get something that kind of looks flower-like almost. We can pull this intensity back just a little bit. If we go up to the twist and we just play around with the twist. Now, of course, you can animate the twists and we can animate these properties if you want to, but we're actually going to add on some other effects. So we're going to grab a roughen edges effect and then a turbulent displace effect. So on the roughen edges, we can increase the border to around 45, and you can see how that kind of softens the edges, but then it also combines some of the tendrils together. And then for the turbulent displace, if we increase this amount a lot, we can get some very weird looking abstract shapes. Or you can also do negative values too. So something like this is what we're going to use for our ink. All right, so let's go back to frame 30. And then on the turbulent displace, we're going to animate the evolution and then the complexity. Start off with the complexity at 1 and the evolution at 0, and then go all the way to the very end. And then we can increase the complexity to something like 1.5 or 2, just so we're adding a little bit of extra motion in there. And for the evolution, we'll do 2 revolutions. So now we got something like this, which is kind of weird looking, and it's probably going a little bit too fast actually. So at the very beginning here, I might actually just increase the evolution, find an interesting looking shape. So now we can go back to the end again, and I need to increase the intensity. So not too dramatic. We want to keep this more subtle. We don't want it to have a lot of motion when it's slowing down towards the end. And then the scale, we can just increase the scale a little bit too. For the size, we can also increase the size, but we're going to increase the size so it like covers the screen, something like 50. And you'll notice that with these effects that we've added, so for the roughen edges and the turbulent displace, we do need to make sure that this layer is actually larger than our canvas. So we can also animate the scale. So we can go to frame 30, click S for scale. Now I'm going to go to frame 37 here and turn the heart back on just so I can see the overall size of that. Then I'm just going to increase that by about 5%, then go to the end, and then we can increase that to around 140%. So I'm going to click U again just to see all the keyframes. Right at the very beginning here for the particle size, we're going to drop this down so it's barely visible. Now, of course, I really want this to be behind the heart, but you could do something in front as if it's erupting through it as well. That looks kind of interesting. But for my example, I'm just going to pull this underneath the element. So we're going to just see it kind of erupting from behind. I'm also going to drop down the size a little bit for the turbulent displace. Adds just a little bit more detail. And then for all 3 of these channels here on the element, I'm going into the graph editor, selecting these points here, and I'm going to use the auto Bezier again to smooth out that position. And then for the intensity, I'm just going to drag this keyframe over so the intensity can stop right here at frame 90. On the particle size, I'm going to ease this value in. And then we can add just a little bit more twist, so it's twirling around a little bit more by going into the Y position and changing that to something like 35 degrees, something kind of like that. So around the heart, right after the explosion, I'm just going to tweak some of these settings just so I can make the ink just a little bit larger. Also just going to lower the intensity just a tad. And at the very beginning here, we could actually set this intensity to something like 200. And then instead of having the scale start at 100, we'll just have that start at 600 too. So I'm just tweaking some of these values just so this ink cloud erupts in the way that I want it to. It's a little hard to control, but playing around with these parameters will yield some pretty interesting looking results. There's also the evolution, so we can play around with a different starting position essentially. And you don't have to animate this, although it's perfectly fine to animate this if you'd like to, but you can just find a different position that you prefer. I'm also going to go into the particle replicator and then just shift this over a little bit to the left, then up very slightly. And then lastly on the roughen edges, we're going to take down the edge sharpness all the way down to 0 just so there's no sharpness there. And again, with the particle size, I'm just going to move this over just so it's much smaller at the very beginning. And of course, you can play around with this for quite a while, getting something that was really interesting. And every time you do this, it's going to be a little bit different, but I think it's a pretty interesting effect. You can also animate this twist X parameter. I would recommend just doing it very, very slightly, but it's something else that you can do as well. Along with all of these other parameters too, which we haven't even touched, like twist Z and altering the phase. So many different random looking weird abstract swirls that you can do with this, and if you blur them enough, it can kind of look like an ink cloud. So this might be a little bit too sharp in places, but next we're going to add some depth of field. So let's close these tabs, make sure everything is visible. All right, so let's go right to the very beginning, double click the camera and enable depth of field. So I'm using an f-stop of 1.4, and for the blur level, I'm just going to crank that all the way up to 1000. And the beginning focal distance, I'm going to pull this back a little bit so the heart is in focus. Notice how the bullet now is out of focus. So let's open up the settings for camera 1, go into camera options, so go to frame 35 and set a keyframe for the focus distance. So now we can go all the way to the very end, and then the focus distance, we can decrease this quite a lot so that we're only getting a few of the particles in focus. Something kind of like that I think is going to work. So let's just take a quick preview and see what we've got so far. Right, so this is looking like a pretty good rough draft first start. You can still tweak some of the animation here where it hitting the heart right at the beginning, just to smooth out some of those keyframes. But then there's something else that I would like to do with the actual heart itself. And that is I'd like to use a custom texture and kind of animate the heart kind of turning black, as if like the poison is kind of infecting all the pieces of the heart. So to do that, we're going to create a new solid, and we'll just call this heart texture. And next we're going to pre-compose it and then go inside the pre-comp. So we're going to say heart texture, and the first one is going to be red. Click enter and then type in red at the end. I'm going to grab a fill effect. Just leave this red. I'm going to duplicate that with Control D and call this one black. You can just get rid of the fill on this effect. And then we need a third solid. Let's call this one matte. And then on this layer, we're going to add a fractal noise effect. So for the fractal type, I'm going to choose dynamic. For the contrast, if we crank the contrast up to something around 200, it's going to be a little bit easier to animate. So open up the transform, and then on the scale that up to about 1000. So this is going to be pretty large. And then for the evolution, I'm going to alt click on the stopwatch for evolution and type time times 100. So then it's always going to be kind of undulating. And then at frame 30, where the heart explodes, I'm going to lower the brightness down until we can only see black. Then keyframe brightness, and then go forward all the way to the end, and then increase the brightness so everything is white. So we get something kind of like that. Next, we can turn off the matte, and then on the heart texture black, we can change the track matte to Luma. So now it's going to start off red because only this layer is visible. Then it's going to kind of fill up like this. All right, so we can go back to our main comp, turn off that effect. Then on the element effect, go down to custom layers, custom texture maps. And then in layer 1, we're going to choose the heart texture comp. And then we're going to change that to effects and masks. Then go inside the scene setup. All right, so we can go to any one of these heart objects. We can just go to the heart upper and then select the shattered heart material. So on the reflectivity, where it says non-set, select that and then click the drop down arrow and select custom layer 1, then click OK. And then we can copy this and then paste it on illumination. So based on the frame you're on, your heart might be black or it might be in between. Mine's kind of in between here. And then we can click OK. You'll notice now that parts of these are black. Now, if you wanted to fill up the inner pieces too, you can do the same thing. But for this middle section here, I do want these to be a little bit brighter. So one thing that we're going to do, if we actually go to the very beginning here at around frame 30, go down to your render settings and then under glow, open up glow, enable glow, and then increase the intensity to something like 2.5. So now you can see that around the areas where it's bright, it's going to have a little bit of an aura around it. And then inside here, I kind of want these little pieces to glow a little bit more. So we're going to go back to the scene setup and then play around with the illumination settings for the material for the inner parts. So in here, we're going to go down to this heart center. All three of these are the same, and actually this is the same material up here as well. So if I want to make sure that this middle piece is separate from the rest of these other materials, if I right click and then say duplicate and replace, we get a copy. And on this copy, we can copy this and paste it on the other materials in the same group. But then I can go down into the illumination and change the intensity to 75 or something like that, just so they're quite a bit brighter inside. Then click OK. So now we get quite a bit more brightness here. And then another thing that we should do is add some ambient occlusion. Go down into render settings, open up ambient occlusion, enable AO. Now on screen space AO, you're barely going to get any AO, so you want to make sure this is set to ray traced. And if the ambient occlusion is too strong, you can come down to the intensity and you can tweak these settings. You can also change the distance as well. So this is set to 100. So we could set this down to 10, and it's really only going to affect the edges here. Or you could do something like 50, then it will apply a little bit more strongly to these. Maybe a value of around 25 would be good. We don't want to make it really, really dark, but there should be some shadows in here. And while we're here, you also want to make sure that you increase the motion blur settings. So open up motion blur, and 6 is almost never enough. So let's try setting that to 24. All right, so next we need to add some text. Now to do that, we're gonna come here towards the end because we're gonna put the text right here. I'm gonna grab the text tool, type in Heartbreaker, then I'm gonna do Control-Alt-Home to center the pivot point, and then Control-Home to center the text in the canvas, and then just pull this up a little bit. I'm just using Myriad Pro, which is my go-to generic text. That's fine. And then for the matte, we're actually gonna use this ink layer. Let's duplicate that, place that above Heartbreaker text, and then I'm going to pre-compose. So I'll just call this text matte, and then I'm going to move all attributes into the new composition. Click OK. I can turn this layer off and then go inside the comp. So I'm going to select the layer, click U to see the keyframes, and then I'm going to turn off scale and then just scale this back to 100%. And then I'm going to add a transform effect. So with the transform effect, what we can do, we can simply uncheck uniform scale, and we can scale this on the X and Y, so we don't have to mess around with this scale over here. Anytime that you want to have additional control of transform, like let's say you've already animated scale or position or something and you want to do something else, is always a really convenient way to add transforms without having to mess around with your existing keyframes or settings. Now, just so I can see this a little bit better, I'm going to just increase the exposure. This is not actually going to render like this, it's just so I can see it a little bit better. And at around frame 80, I want to have this start. So what we need to do in order to see what this is actually doing, let's go back to our main comp, change our Heartbreaker track matte to alpha. We're going to lock the composition, double click the text matte, and drag the text map over to the side here so we can see what the result is while working inside the text matte. Next, I'm going to duplicate this layer twice, and then we're going to just move this over a little bit. So as this appears on the second one, I just want to move this over. Then I'm going to flip the orientation, so layer, transform, flip vertical. I can then offset these keyframes just a little bit to see more clearly in our main composition. Let's go ahead and solo the ink and the text layer, and then we can just preview that as we go. So we can get a pretty interesting looking matte like this. And then we can just tweak the position just to make sure that that goes to the edge of the word. On ink 2 for the height, I'm going to crank that up a little bit. And then on the third one, I'll flip this horizontally. And then just go ahead and play around with the position of the mattes so you get an interesting reveal. So something like that. All right, next we can close the main comp. We can close out of the window, go back to the main comp. At frame 70, I'm actually gonna make the text a little bit smaller. So click S for scale, scale this down to about 80%. Keyframe that, go forward to the end, then we'll scale that back up to 100. I'm also gonna put a transform effect on this, just so I can lower the height a little bit, like 95. Of course, I could also go into the text tools and lower the vertical scale here, but using a transform effect is sometimes more convenient. All right, so what we're gonna do, we're actually gonna have 3 layers like this. So this one is gonna be called Heartbreaker Black, and on this one, we're gonna grab a fill effect and then make the fill effect black. Then we're gonna select both the text and the matte, duplicate them with Ctrl D, just click enter to rename it, call this one red. Then on the fill effect, we'll just grab a reddish color, like a dark red. Then duplicate them both again and rename the last one to be white. And then we'll just grab kind of an off-white color. Not 100% white, but something like 85 to 90% white. So on the matte for Heartbreaker Red, we can grab a roughen edges effect. And on the border, we can crank this up quite a lot. So if we go backwards just a little bit, you'll be able to see what this is doing. For the edge sharpness, we can do something like 0.75. And the scale is 50, so you can see the red parts coming through. And then on the matte for Heartbreaker White, we can grab another roughen edges. And then on this one, we're gonna crank that border up quite a lot. Drop down the sharpness to about 0.25. And now we have like 3 levels of color. We get some black edges, some red, and some white. And then you can play around with the settings on the roughen edges to get a pretty interesting looking result. That transitions a little fast, so I might actually just lock this again, go into the text matte. So just tweaking those masks a little bit. I try to make these tutorials as short as possible, but most of the time you still have to go ahead and finesse the animations down. So this is what we got so far, but after a little bit of tweaking with various parameters and some of the timing, this is the end result that I came up with. Alright, so that wraps up this tutorial. If you learned something, clicking like really helps me out. And if you have any questions, be sure to post a comment. I also have a Discord server now, so it's a little easier to ask questions and post screenshots. So check that out if you're interested. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Peace.